Today I'm going to give a talk titled Commingled, Communal, and Complex, Reconstructing Iberian Copper Age Mortuary Practices. However, before I start, I have a warning for any archaeologists who might be listening to this talk. Don't work in Spain. The landscape is dull, the architecture is uninspired, the food is terrible, and, of course, the archaeology is utterly unappealing. However, there are good reasons to stomach some of these hardships if, like me, you're obsessed with things beginning with C. Methodologically, I'm interested in developing strategies to maximize the information recovered from commingled remains. Chronologically, I'm interested in the Copper Age, the period about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in Spain, and theoretically, I'm interested in early increases in social complexity. In particular, I ask, how do people in early complex societies handle the considerable difficulties of living in more populous communities? Do they rely on the maintenance of relatively egalitarian social structures, or is there a rise in unequal access to resources? And finally, how do we handle these questions when individuals are buried communally and remains are commingled? The period I'll focus on today is the Iberian Copper Age, which stretched from about 4,000 to 5,000 years before the present. It's a time characterized by significant social changes. This is when people first began farming more intensively and relying on the secondary products of domesticates. And there are also concomitant changes in material culture in terms of the circulation of exotic or elaborate artifacts. However, the reason I'm most interested in the Copper Age is that it's when we really begin to see people start to aggregate into larger settlements. While populations during the preceding Neolithic period were small and dispersed, during the Copper Age people began to congregate in larger settlements called matrix villages or megavillages. Some of the most famous Spanish examples are Los Miares, shown on the left, and Valencina de la Concepcion, shown on the right, outside of the modern-day city of Seville. My current research focuses on collections from the site of Marroquíes Bajos, another matrix village that's located in the city of Jaén, about an hour north of Granada. Marroquíes gives us the opportunity to investigate what life was like for the people that lived in these larger aggregations, and to examine the types of social organization that underlay these new large-scale villages. The site was salvage excavated in the 1990s due to the northward expansion of the city of Jaén. It's a massive 113-hectare enclosure site with a series of concentric ditches expanding outward from the settlement's center. The fourth ditch is surrounded by a 2-kilometer-long adobe wall, which separates the likely habitation area of the site from outer-lying storage and fields. But, as a bioarchaeologist, I have something of a one-track mind. And the reason that I'm interested in the site is because there are also 7 different mortuary areas uncovered during the course of excavations. 2 of these mortuary areas have previously been analyzed by Spanish teams. These are the ones shown in red. And I'm conducting a bioarchaeological analysis of the remaining larger mortuary areas, shown in green, for my current research. All of these collections are housed in the Museum of Jaén, where I spent 8 months between 2013 and 2014 analyzing materials that were located, for the most part, in the basement. I examined 3 different mortuary areas. Necropolis 1 is situated between the 4th and 5th ditch of Marroquíes Bajos, in the northwest quadrant of the settlement. Salvage excavations showed that this mortuary area was characterized by a mixture of primary and secondary burials, found in 6 different mortuary structures. Here, detailed hand-drawn site maps, like the one on the slide, document more than 40 human burials. Like Necropolis 1, Necropolis 2 is located inside the 5th ditch of the settlement. Salvage excavations in 2006 revealed 5 discrete mortuary structures. Descriptions in site reports, photographs of the excavation context, and the conditions of the remains themselves indicate that these inhumations were extremely fragmentary and commingled in situ. Finally, Necropolis 4 is the only necropolis located outside of the 5th ditch of the settlement. It comprises a series of artificial caves located on the lower slope of the hill of Santa Catalina. This site has been excavated 4 times, in 1957, 1959, 1964, and 2001. While there was commingling within the cave, remains were also commingled post-excavation. All told, these materials represent over 700 pounds of commingled and unclean bone and sediment, a significant volume of material, as you can see in the photo on the right-hand corner of the slide. So, as a result of the different composition of each mortuary area, I took 2 different approaches to this analysis. I conducted a full bioarchaeological analysis for both N1 and N2, which included all dental and skeletal material recovered. However, because of the sheer volume of the remains at Necropolis 4, I only conducted a dental analysis for that area. This led me to ask two preliminary questions. First, are subadults, or individuals under about 18 years of age, included in mortuary practices at these new Matrix Village sites? And second, can we reconstruct evidence about prehistoric mortuary practices using only the dentition? Subadults generally comprise between 10 and 60% of the mortuary population at sites in late prehistoric Iberia. However, their degree of inclusion at these larger Matrix Village sites has been underexplored. Marroquíes Bajos presents a unique instance of early population aggregation at a new type of large-scale center, so it's important to explore whether people at this settlement were replicating earlier forms of Iberian funerary practices or were using new types of mortuary practices to integrate their larger and more diverse community. I used typical methods to age individuals, examining patterning of epiphyseal fusion, long bone size, dental eruption, and dental wear. On this slide, you can see individual 13.21 from Necropolis 1, with an estimated age of between 4 and 7 years, with reference to maximum diaphyseal length and dental eruption. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm only examining the mortuary populations from N1 and N2, because the subadult dental analysis of Necropolis 4 is not yet complete. I found that at each analyzed mortuary area, subadults make up between 24 and 32% of the MNI, or minimum number of individuals, a range comparable to other smaller sites in Iberia at this time. However, knowing that subadults are included in the mortuary areas at Marroquíes Bajos doesn't tell us much about whether they were treated the same way as adults. To address that question, I calculated the expected MNE, or the number of bones you'd expect to find in one individual. Then, I looked at the percentage of expected MNE, which is a measure of how complete an individual skeleton is. When I examined percentage of expected MNE for subadult and adult burials, two things immediately became clear. First, both adults and subadults received primary and secondary burial. Neither mortuary treatment was constrained by age. Second, though percentage completion was always lower for subadults, which is likely related to taphonomic factors and the problems of excavating smaller and more fragile subadult bones, the overall pattern of completion was the same for both adults and subadults, highest for primary burials and lowest for secondary burials. Importantly, when primary and secondary burials are examined separately, anatomical patterning is also similar between adults and subadults. In the adult assemblage shown on the slide, skull and limb bones predominate, and smaller bones of the hands, feet, ribs, and spine are less well represented, particularly for secondary burials. The anatomical composition of the subadult assemblage is similar to that documented for adults at Marroquíes Bajos, in which primary interments are also more likely to include higher numbers of vertebrae, ribs, and bones of the hands and feet. What this essentially means is that subadult bodies are being treated in a similar fashion to adult bodies. So to answer my first question, are subadults included in mortuary practices at these new Matrix Village sites? Yes. Despite its novel status as a large-scale settlement, the pattern of interment at Marroquíes precisely replicates mortuary practices in existence since the late Neolithic, when subadult remains were given similar mortuary treatments to adult remains and buried together with adults. So even though people are living in a newer and more aggregated settlement, they're not really breaking with previous mortuary tradition. So to answer our first question, are subadults included in mortuary practices at these new Matrix Village sites? Yes, they are. Despite its novel status as a large-scale settlement, the pattern of interment at Marroquíes precisely replicates mortuary practices in existence since the late Neolithic, when subadult remains were given similar mortuary treatments to adult remains and buried together with adults. So even though people are living in newer and more aggregated settlements, they're not really breaking with previous mortuary tradition. Moving on to my second question, can we make inferences about prehistoric mortuary practices using only the dentition? As you'll recall, N4 was a necropolis for which I only collected dental data. Accordingly, I wanted to figure out whether I could reconstruct the mortuary practices likely in use at N4 by only examining its dental signature. First, I wanted to examine the data collected for N1 and N2, because at those two sites I used skeletal data and site documentation to distinguish primary and secondary burials. And if those signatures differed, if primary was distinct to secondary, then the signatures could each be compared to the signature at N4 to assess what kinds of mortuary practices were being used there. And for the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing solely on the adult dentition. The first step in this analysis involved locating all of the teeth through carefully screening the remains from all 3 necropolises for any dentition. In total, I recovered almost 4,800 teeth from all 3 mortuary areas, and I would like to point out over 60% of these were loose, so it was a significant labor investment. The second step involved collecting informative dental data. I collected data on the category of tooth, for example, lower left second molar, the stage of development, level of wear, metrics, pathologies, and things of that nature. Finally, in order to compare differences between the necropolises and between the different types of burial, primary versus secondary, I decided to examine the percentage of expected dentition that was preserved for each necropolis. This is a relatively simple calculation. First, I calculated a dental MNI for each necropolis using the right upper canine. Then, I made the assumption that an adult individual should have been buried with 28 teeth. Here, I'm dropping the third molar from this analysis because I haven't yet calculated the frequency of third molar agenesis for this population. And this allowed me to produce an expected count of teeth for an entire necropolis by multiplying the total number of adult individuals by 28. Finally, taking the number of teeth observed and dividing by the number of teeth expected gives us a percentage value. And I also incorporated the overall population rate of antemortem tooth loss for each type of tooth when I was calculating each expected value. So sometimes the values you'll see will exceed 100% of expected for that reason. I also took a cue from forensic taphonomy research and sorted my teeth into mesial, middle, and distal categories when conducting these analyses. Forensic taphonomists have noted that incisors, being both single root and anterior, are most likely to be lost when the periodontal ligament decays during composition. So I wanted to explore the assumption that secondary burials would be characterized by extremely low levels of incisors relative to other types of dentition. Importantly, I did find that mesial teeth are more poorly represented than middle or distal teeth. To orient you to these graphs, the percentage of expected values are displayed on the y-axis, and these show how many teeth we have relative to how many teeth we expect given the dental MNI. Primary burials are shown in blue, and secondary burials are shown in red. This difference holds when individual tooth categories are examined, but there's also a large gap in the preservation of premolars. In particular, I found that central and lateral incisors and P3s and P4s all showed the greatest differences between primary and secondary burials when it came to their percentage of expected values. Finally, this difference is particularly pronounced for lower incisors and premolars. The lower arcade is shown on the slide, and as you can see, there's about a 50% difference between primary and secondary burials in the percentage of observed versus expected central incisors and premolars. So, what does N4 look like relative to the primary and secondary signatures? In terms of the total percentage of expected values, N4 falls between the primary and secondary burials. Again, primary burials are shown in blue, secondary are shown in red, and the N4 signature is shown in the middle in green. When I examined the percentage of expected dentition preserved at N4, I found that it fell in between the primary and secondary signatures. And while there's some variability, this difference also holds when things are broken down into individual tooth types. To me, this means it's likely that primary and secondary burials were both being interred in this necropolis. My next step is figuring out a way to statistically test the magnitude of the difference between expected and observed values for these different types of teeth, to see if incisors or premolars are actually significantly less likely to be recovered from secondary contexts. Alright, so we've answered the first question, and in answer to that second question, yes, we can make some inferences about prehistoric mortuary practices even if we're only working with a sample of dentition. In conclusion, using techniques like these will bring us even closer to reconstructing the kinds of social strategies that first enabled people to aggregate at larger matrix village sites. And these preliminary studies also serve to illustrate that prehistoric remains that are commingled and fragmentary can still be extremely informative about the past. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the funding sources and all of the people that have helped me conduct this research.